Well, good evening and welcome to our second session of the Online Christian Writers Group. I'm Eric Elder and I'm really glad to have all of you here. Tonight we're going to be talking about how to get started, getting started with writing a book or a project or an article. And I hear from a lot of people that say, you know, I have these ideas for a book, I want to write a book, or I want to write about something, and I just don't know how to get started. I have all these ideas swirling around. How do I start? And so for some of this might be a review for you, but for others, I hope it'll be, you'll walk out of here tonight with just a game plan for how you're going to start writing. And we'll even give you some exercise time at the end to begin writing right now and just get the pump primed a little bit. Just to review, my purpose for this group is really to flood the market with Christian writers, Christian thought, Christian thinking. It doesn't even have to be specifically Christian teaching books, but from a Christian worldview, whether you're writing fantasy novels or romance novels or narrative biographies about your life. I just think that it would be wonderful to have more and more people of faith, of a Christian faith, to really flood the market. If I write one or two books, I can touch a lot of people, but if I can encourage others to write one or two books or 10 or 20 books, we can touch millions. And so my desire, my heart, and when I get to heaven, is to return to God many faithful men and women, people who have been faithful with their gifts and who have explored them, dove into them, tried them out. And so this is just my heart behind it, is why I really want to encourage as many people as they can to tell their stories, to talk about Christ, to bring Christ into a world that needs him desperately. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight, and I have three of us are going to share how we start writing. Myself, and then Bridget Booth, who's a dear friend for years and a professional writer. She gets paid for the work she does, which is great. And Kent Sanders, who's also written books, and he does consulting and helps others, and he does ghostwriting. And so he's going to share too. And several of you have written, and so I'd love to hear your ideas as we go along too. But that's the main idea for tonight. In the first hour, we're going to talk about getting started writing. And the second hour, we'll take more questions and get to know each other a little more. And hopefully that will help everyone be encouraged in whatever spot you are right now. I'd love to pray, if you just pray with me. Thanks, Lord, for this night, and thanks for these people who have come, and thanks for people who are watching this later. I pray, God, you would inspire each one of us in our writing, in our gifting, whatever it is, Lord, to be faithful stewards of the gifts you've given us, the stories you've given us, the insights you've taught us, Lord. And I pray we would be able to touch millions collectively through our writing and through our hearts and through our thoughts and through our love for you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Terrific. From time to time, I'm going to look over at Dan, my friend and co-worker at Eastview, who is going to call on people or answer questions. So Dan, just feel free to interrupt me if you see someone has a question and I'm talking, or someone's talking and we need to take a quick break. There's a verse I want to start with too. This is from John chapter 20, verse 31. And it's John, the Apostle John, great friend of Jesus, and he wrote the book of John, and he says why he wrote it in chapter 20, verse 31. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. And my heart is to bring life, the life of Jesus, to as many people as we can, whether that's overtly or implicitly or whatever way we can, to give people Jesus. That's my heartbeat. You might have a different heartbeat or motive for writing, but this is an online Christian writers group, and so this is my heartbeat. I'd love to teach you whatever I can about that. I guess I'm going to go first, just because I just am going to go first about how I write and how I got started. And I'm going to share two secrets with you after everybody else goes, but I'm going to share three main things right now of how I write. And the ultimate thing is the best way to learn how to write is to start writing. I've heard the best way to learn how to pray is to start praying. And really, whether you're writing in a journal, whether you're writing a Facebook post, whether you're writing blog posts, whether you're writing books, whether you're writing a letter to a friend. I think just starting writing and just, putting it out there, delivering it to an audience that can see it, react to it, see how they respond to it. You're going to get the best feel for your style, your method of writing, your, what the way God has wired you. So we're going to give you a lot of different approaches and ways that you could write, but honestly and truly, the best way you can learn how to pray or learn how to write or probably learn how to do a lot of things is to just start doing it. And then the education follows, and you're going to see where your gaps are, where you need help. And maybe a group like this can help fill in some of those gaps, and maybe that's why you're here. But really, the bottom line is just to start writing. That just do it. It's the Nike slogan. You just do it, and you just start. But I know it's helpful sometimes to just give people practical. Okay, so how do you do it? And so here are 3 ways that I do it. One is topical. I also write piano music, so I wrote a CD of a dozen songs. It's called Clear My Mind, and you can listen on Spotify and iTunes and Pandora. I'm not a commercial here, but this was 20 years ago. I wrote these songs. And at the same time, I thought, it would be nice to tell sort of the story that goes behind them. So topically, I just created a little booklet that tucks inside the CD cover. And each page just has one little short devotional about the song. It sort of tells why I wrote the song. They're instrumental songs, so people wouldn't know what the words are or what the inspiration was behind them. And so I thought it would be nice. And I went away for a week. I had heard other people do this. They'll go away to a cabin or something. And I had a chance to get away for a week by myself. And I just wrote every day and tried to whittle it down and narrow it down. And I think, Bridget, you helped me edit this project 20 years ago, my first little writing project. And I came back with a nice little devotional book of 12 to 14 devotionals, and it just went along with each CD. So it was natural. It was easy for me to do because I knew why I wrote the songs, and it was easy for me to sit down and write it. It's harder a little bit to edit and to get it down and make it useful to someone else. So that's where editors come in and rewrites come in and all that stuff. But to do the initial writing was fairly easy because I knew the topic well. Some people like Jonah, you'll find out later, he's interested in sort of fantasy writing and creating a whole world. That's wonderful when you've got the imagination for it, but it takes a lot of work to create a whole world and the rules of how it works and how different things interact in that new world. That's a lot harder, I would say, from my perspective. Maybe Jonah finds it easier, but it's easier for me just to write about my life, write about something that I know really well. And so, depending on what your bent is, you might just want to start writing something topically, something that just appeals to you. Really writing about something you're passionate about is a huge way to get started. I know for my kids, we homeschooled our 6 kids. I've got one still in homeschool, a year and a half to go. And I'll have completed, between my wife and me, 25 years of homeschooling. But one year, we hired a prestigious college professor to come and teach writing, and she would teach the kids writing once a week, and she would give them different assignments and all kinds of stuff, and they sort of resisted and rebelled, and it was hard, and it was just not going anywhere. And then my kids loved this Christian author, Ted Decker, and they got on a discussion group with other people who loved Ted Decker, and they started writing volumes. I mean, they could write about the book. They would talk to their friends, and they're all chat. And I'd read some of their essays about what they loved. It was like massive book reports that we didn't even assign. And so I think when you're passionate about a topic, that can really help your writing. Sometimes it's hard to get started because you're not sure what to write about. Kent might talk a little about that too. How do you decide your topic? But for me, a topical kind of writing came very naturally and easily for me. The second way out of the 3 that I'm going to share is just writing weekly. I had a weekly email list that I would write to people who would donate to my ministry. I do an online ministry called theranch.org, and I would really send out a message, but I knew in a fundraising letter, it's also helpful to give something for the people who are reading it. So it really started as a way for me just to write to supporters and tell them thank you and encourage them to keep giving. But I also tried to give them something for their life as well. And that turned into a weekly devotional that wasn't related to fundraising at all. And so I just started writing every week. And that turned into what I've done for the last 10 or 15 years, which is writing devotional books. This is one that I wrote initially called Exodus Lessons in Freedom. And I just went through the book of Exodus. Really, it was a personal Bible study for me to learn how Moses worked with all these people to get them free out in the desert. And I was trying to run a major ministry myself. And I was like, Moses, how in the world did you do this? How did you, I don't know how you did it. So I was just praying. I wasn't thinking writing a book at the time, just saying, God, help me understand some leadership principles. How do I make this work? And so I just started reading through the book of Exodus. I had a little notepad, like a little hotel notepad with a bunch of papers on it. And every day I would just sit in my quiet time and I'd just start reading Exodus and say, God, show me something in here that would help me run my ministry better. And pretty soon I filled up about 50 little notepads over 50 days. And I used that as my game plan for how I was going to use my ministry and run my ministry and work with volunteers. And so it really wasn't meant to be a book. But then I thought, this might be helpful for other people. So since I was writing this weekly devotional, I thought, well, I'll just take one topic a week for 50 weeks, and that's almost a year. And so I just wrote out, instead of this little paragraph that I put on here, for me, I wrote out a 500 to 700 word devotional and what God had shown me. And I started sending that out to people. And that email list grew to about 40,000 people in 160 countries at the time. And, it somehow it resonated with people, and it helped people. And probably because God had downloaded all this information to me, I wasn't trying to come up with new material. I was just saying, God, help me. I need help. And he helped me. And then I share that with other people. And so I've written a number of other devotionals since then. So this is sort of the weekly writing. I did 30 lessons on the book of Acts and how to have more faith, lessons in faith. And when you have faith, you can be healed. When you have faith, you can be saved. When you have faith, you can be forgiven. And I just started looking for what are the different things that faith would do for people in the book of Acts. And then I'd spent another 20 weeks on grace in the book of Ephesians. And the word grace was just everywhere in the short book of Ephesians. And I just wanted to be a more graceful person. I didn't feel like I was very full of grace towards some people in particular, and I said, how do I be more grace-filled? And so I was just asking God. And so each week I would just write, here's a way I can be more gracious to people. Here's a way I can be more gracious to my kids or my family. So a lot of my weekly writing is, just my walk with God, just saying, God, help me today. And I share what I'm learning with others. The nice thing about weekly writing is that you're disciplined and you have a deadline. And I had by Sunday morning, Jeanette has helped me edit some of those weekly messages too. And sometimes it's 3 a.m. and I'm shooting off a message and saying, it's Sunday morning and I've got to send something out by 7 a.m. And Jeanette's reading it and going, okay, all right, got it done. There are probably better ways to do all that process, but by having that deadline and that weekly goal, at the end of it, I would have a book and I could put it all together, upload all my messages to Amazon in a PDF file. And I didn't pay anything for this. It was free to upload this and upload a cover for it. And I can order them for myself for $2.15 for this little tiny of a book. And then I can sell it to people for $10 or $12, $15 or something and make some profit. So it's a nice way to keep funding your writing, and without having any cost involved or having to deal with traditional publishers. We'll talk about traditional publishers down the road, and there are others here in the group, Mary and others who have used more traditional or hybrid publishers. But for me, this has been really great because the material's already written. I don't need someone to bankroll me on the front end to write the book. I just need a way to get it out to people. And so it's up on Amazon, and now I have about 25 books like that. So that's the second way. So the first way was just some topical thing. Topical. And the second one is sort of a weekly thing. Let me make one note about the weekly. William Faulkner, he has a quote and he says, I only write when I'm inspired. Fortunately, I'm inspired by 9 o'clock every morning. And so this is something that you sort of have to build in if you want to be a writer. Sometimes you just got to have your, Mary has a phrase for it. What do you say, Mary? Maybe you don't know what I'm talking about. But,
No, what is my phrase? Can you hear me?
something about sitting in your seats, just
Oh, a common fiction phrase. I don't know if it would apply to any writing. BUTT in chair, hands on keyboard, tapping away madly. So bottom in chair.
yeah.
So if I'm doing like cleaning around the house, usually I get a conviction that that's real nice, but that's not the chair I need to be taken care of. I need to be sitting down.
So get your bottom in your chair, hands on the keyboard, and what was the one? Typing madly?
Tapping away madly.
Typing away madly. So, and it, the last way that I do books, and this is sort of thanks to National Novel Writing Contest, National Novel Writing Month, NaNoWriMo, in November. I encourage people to write a 50,000 word novel in a month. And I mentioned this last time, but the goal is to just start writing each day, write as much as you can. And, we've got jobs, we've got other things we're doing in our life. We can't maybe spend 8 hours a day or 4 hours a day or 2 hours a day. But I've found that I can spend 1 hour a day during the month of November, and I can write a 500 to 700 word chapter. It's just a first draft of a chapter of a book. And my first 30-day novel was this one, St. Nicholas the Believer, about the real life St. Nicholas who lived back in the 3rd and 4th century. And my wife and I had researched his life and had come up with stories that we wanted. And I just jotted down on one page of a yellow legal pad 30 stories that I wanted to tell about his life, and how his parents died from a plague, and how he spared 3 girls from slavery by throwing bags of gold through their window, and different stories from his life. And I tried to make it in a novel form. And so I just laid out these 30 stories, and every morning for 30 days, I would just get up and I'd have my quiet time. My other secret, I write in the bathtub. I mean, that's might not be good for books or iPads or anything, but I'll just write. And with 6 kids, I can turn on the heater fan in the bathroom, close the door, and for an hour, I can just sit and write. So there's some other motivations behind it. It's my little prayer closet, my writing closet. But I actually finished this. I've never finished in 30 days, but I would say 30 writing days. So I might not get to write every day for 30 days, but I could spend an hour, once, twice, 3 times, 4 times a week. And in November, early December, I can finish up a first draft of a whole book, and then take 6 months later to, over 6 months, flesh out each chapter, make it a little more compelling storytelling, better dialogue, ask friends to read it, get feedback, do rewriting and editing. But then I can have a book by the following summer. And this book is done well, and it's been turned into a ballet. We're just turning it into a movie. So there's other things that we can do with these writings, but once you write it down, then the world can do lots of fun things with it. So I've written several books that way. I did that one in I think 2009. I wrote the first draft of that, so about 10 or 11 years ago. And I've tried to do that every November since then. And I've written a book, 50 Shades of Grace. This is under a pen name, Nicholas Deer, but this is just my testimony of how I came to faith in Christ, how God redeemed a broken part of my life and my sexuality, and gave me an incredible wife and 6 kids, and really turned my world around. But this wasn't something I wanted to write and publish every week. I didn't even know if I would send this out publicly. In fact, I sent it to Kent and just very few people each chapter, to say, is this even something that anybody would read? Is this helpful? Is this too over the edge? I'm talking about some intimate details of my life. And got some great feedback from them. And so it's, some of these projects you'd rather just sit down and sit for just a block of time, but it doesn't have to take, a week away at a cabin. You can do it. I just finished a new book called My Stories of Faith, the draft of it, and I just use my iPad, before I got out of bed in the morning, I just hand wrote with my pencil here on it, and I just wrote about 700 words every morning before I got out of bed. I had listed out on my iPhone, I just listed 30 stories that I wanted to tell. So over a period of a few weeks, I just said, oh, I'd love to tell that story about when I was baptized. I'd love to tell the story about when I prayed for a woman to be healed. I'd love to tell that story about when this child was born, when the couple was infertile. I'd love to tell, just these different stories of faith, how I've seen God work in my life. And so every morning I'd sort of pick one. I didn't even have to go in order. I just picked one that I felt like I'd love to write about that. And after 30 days, I had a book. And it's in draft mode right now. Someone's looking at it right now to sort of edit it for me, to just see, general editing. But then I'm going to go back over the next few months and try to flesh it out, add some scriptures, add some extra storytelling elements that would make it readable as a whole book, from start to finish. But that's sort of this third way is, just sit down for a block of time, maybe 30 days, and just write. Don't edit, don't try to fix anything, just get those thoughts out of your head. So that's just a goal that you might want to do. So I've talked a lot here for these first 20 minutes or so. For the next half hour or so, I want to hear from Bridget and Kent. And then in our second hour, we'll go into a more interactive discussion just about your own projects and get to introduce each one personally as well. So Bridget, I could try to introduce you, but maybe you could give a little introduction first too, and you'll have to unmute yourself, of course. But Bridget's been a friend for years and years. We worked together back in the IT department at Texaco down in Houston, Texas, and worked on a lot of projects. She worked with Lana closely as well, and great friends with her prior to her passing, unfortunately. But Bridget's been a great friend. She's a writer, she's an editor, she's a test grader for professional SATs and things like that. So I thought she might have some great insights for us on how to start writing.
Hello. I just want to piggyback on something that Eric mentioned about accountability or just that checking in. And I will say that has been probably the most productive thing I've ever done in my writing is to have some kind of accountability with somebody else. And I have currently I have like a writing buddy that we check in with every day about our goals and are we writing and are we meeting certain things. And that a lot of times I won't do it for myself, but if I know somebody else is expecting an answer, then I'll show up and I get projects finished. So I'm just saying that I just wanted to add that to what Eric said before I completely forgot. Just briefly, as Eric said, I've been doing this for a long time, and I don't have a really good elevator pitch. I'm sorry. But for the longest time, I wrote for magazines, and back when there were magazines and not online. And I was like a contributing writer for Focus on the Family and things like that. And so that was mainly how I did a lot of my writing. And in developing those articles or any kind of nonfiction, I found that usually they were assignments. So when Eric was talking about how he comes up with his nonfiction ideas, I thought, I've always been just given an assignment. Now I do a lot of newsletters and blogging and those kind of things. And my strategy is always to just answer a question. So for instance, I would like start with a structure, like if I'm going to write an article or something, I try to answer a question like 3 tips for planting a garden or something like that, that it just answers a question. And those are the way that's how I develop. I'm very boring and plain Jane in that, if I were to write a nonfiction book, I would start with the first thing I do is go research how to write a book proposal, simply because it's the plain Jane model of coming up with an outline and having to answer all those questions. And then I would have an outline, a really good detailed outline. So if I was to write a nonfiction book, I would go about it very differently than the way Eric does it, just because I very vanilla.
Because you're very smart and you make money at this project. I don't.
Well,
That's why I invited you on, Bridget.
No, well, I just my point when I'm writing nonfiction particularly is not to waste time and just churn out as many words as possible. So it's not, and if that's not your idea, or if that's not what you are if that's not your goal, then I know that advice doesn't really help. But I am always looking at how many words can I get out in a certain amount of time, and so that's why I do that. And when I'm writing a series of blog posts or anything like that, I am trying my best to make it as time efficient as possible. So that's my approach to nonfiction. In the last 5-7 years, I've switched to fiction writing, and that's a completely different animal. And I've had to relearn how to start a project, because I assumed that my skills would transfer very easily, but they didn't. And I've been told that other people do it pretty easily. I couldn't do it. So I wandered in the wilderness for quite some time, trying to figure out how to write a fiction book. And by fiction, I'm talking about genre mainly. I've done a little bit of literary writing, but that's not really my skill set. So anyway, so if any of you are writing fiction, then what I have learned is, again, I start with efficiency. I'm not a pantser. If you've ever heard of the term, some people write just as they go, and they develop a plot and characters as they write, just every day. I do not have that kind of imagination, nor that I would cry every day if I sat down at the keyboard and had to do that. Generally what I do is I start with an idea, and I write it into a sentence, maybe 2 or 3 sentences. And then I start asking myself questions. And like, well, if this story is about a sailor, then why is he a sailor? And what's his history? And I just start asking questions. And once I get enough questions, then I develop what people will call a synopsis, which is really just a very detailed outline for a plot. And it starts at, this is what's gonna happen in the story from beginning to end. And I'm talking about, like, this is a 4-paragraph essay, it's synopsis. You can do like a 2 or 3 page synopsis, but I usually just start with trying to get it into 4 paragraphs or something of that equation. And then I look at what I have, and then I start poking holes and to that, and asking myself, okay, well, what kind of conflict is this? And certainly if I'm writing in a genre, which I do. There's certain scenes that have to be in a genre. If you're writing romance, you're going to write about the meet, what they call the cute meet, the meet cute. There's going to be a grand gesture. There's certain scenes that have to be there. If you have a mystery, usually you got a dead body. I don't know. I don't write mysteries. But there's certain scenes that have to be there, and I zero in on those scenes and say, okay, do I have those scenes? And usually the answer is no, because my imagination is pretty weak. And so I have to ask more questions. And then by the end of this exercise, I have a very fleshed out outline of the story. And I have a really good idea of the scenes that I'm going to have. There may be, like, say, 10 or 12 key scenes that have to be there, and I know exactly what those are. And so I have all those answers, and then I start writing. So again, whether it's nonfiction or fiction, I am really boring. I do a lot of planning, but anyway, that's how I go about it. And I'm just trying to think if there's anything else. I'm just not as creative as Eric at all.
You're terrific, and she's very methodical, and that's why I just love her writing and what she produces. And I think her, the 3 points that I got out of what you were saying, the first thing you were talking about, just answering one question, and that's for like articles, right? Or for really for a whole book. It's like, what's the one question? What's the one topic? The one angle? What are you trying to answer here? I think it's really good to have that one driving force that everything else is judged by. The second thing you were talking about, just researching a book proposal. What does a book proposal look like? And if you've never looked at one or looked at an example, that's wonderful, because it says, what's unique about your book? What other books are out there similar to it? What does each chapter look like? They want you to give a little sentence or two about each chapter, and then a writing sample maybe of, your introduction or first couple chapters. And so to actually go through those steps of creating a book proposal, I find it to be hard work and tedious and like schoolwork, but it makes the rest of writing really, really enjoyable and useful. And then the third thing you said, just about the researching your genre and the whole, what has to be in a genre, and what, there are certain elements that need to be in romance novels. Mary writes romance novels, and she knows it has to have X, Y, and Z and a happy ending, or whatever the thing is for it to be a successful romance novel. You could have everyone die at the end, but that would be, a Shakespearean tragedy. So you just have to, you just got to know your genre and your readers. And so there's lots of things. So hopefully you're at least hearing terms. If you've never heard any of these terms, you're hearing lots of terms. You're hearing a few approaches, and Bridget could call it boring. I call it very studious and very smart planning. I also saw Mary made a comment. Bridget mentioned pantster, meaning by the seat of their pants, and versus a plotter, someone who has to know everything from the beginning. And so whether you're a pantster or a plotter, I've never heard those two before, so that's new for me tonight. Thanks for introducing those terms.
I think, Eric, we had a question.
Okay.
For Bridget. The question is, how did you get those assignments? And Bridget, I think this harkens back early to just when you started your talk.
Okay, first of all, this is going back years, but I put out a lot when I first got started in writing articles, because that's all I could do. I mean, I could write an article. It was short and it was concise, and I had small children at the time, so I was always looking at the time and how much time did I have. So articles is really where I focus. So I sent out letters at the time. That shows you how long ago that was. Physical letters, and then later they became emails. But just saying, okay, I can write this article for you, and similar to, it's called a query, but you would query and say, here's an article I can write, and you pitch it to them. I wouldn't write it until someone said, yes, I'm willing to pay you for that. So, because I wasn't going to waste my time writing something that I wasn't going to get paid for. That led to, I ended up meeting many magazine editors, and that led to them asking, oh, would you write for us on a regular basis? And so one of the editors that I pitched to was, I was actually a contributing writer on multiple magazines in order to make any kind of money. And they were all editors I came in contact with when I initially I pitched them. And I will say I pitched them, and I reject. Oh yeah, we'll pay you, and they throw money at me, and then they get to know your name. You develop a relationship, just like in any other business. You develop a relationship with them, and they know you're reliable, and then they start asking you, hey, would you write this article, and would you interview this musician or something like that? And you're like, hey, yeah. That sounds fun. so that's how that came to be for me. And anybody else who's traveled that similar path, the things that are similar is just putting yourself out there regularly, expecting to be told no, mostly, and then eventually you develop a relationship with somebody, and they will ask you to help them. And that's what it becomes. It becomes you're somebody they can trust, so they want you to work with them.
That's terrific. And I hope to do a longer segment with Bridget. I'm hoping to start a podcast soon where I can just interview people one-on-one and spend time on things like exactly that. How do you get paying gigs, and other great topics. And we'll cover a little of that as we go down the road too. Terrific answer. Thanks. I want to turn to Kent Sanders now. Kent is a professor at St. Louis Christian College. He's worship leader extraordinaire. He is communications manager. He's a podcaster and consultant extraordinaire, and a dear friend extraordinaire as well. Kent, if you want to introduce any other way, but I asked Kent because he's very much a teacher, and I asked him, I said, Kent, do you have any ways that you would want to encourage the group to get started writing? He said, oh yes, I have that. And he gave me his 12-point outline of how he encourages people to do this, which I love because I do not have that. Kent, I give it to you.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. And I did have some stuff prepared, but I'm totally throwing that out the window and going a different direction with this. One thing, and this is just kind of a random collection of things. So when Eric is talking about how do you actually get writing done, I'm just going to share with you some things that are working for me right now at this stage of what I'm doing. I'm not saying that they're necessarily going to work for you, but they're things that really have helped me in the last couple of years. So I'm a big fan of looking around in your life and seeing what opportunities you have literally right in front of you. And one of the things that has actually been really helpful to me is using my day job to develop some writing and marketing skills. I know that that's not going to apply to everybody, but so I'm a college professor by day. And a few years ago, I started pitching some ideas to my academic dean, who is my direct boss, about some courses that I could teach. Like one course was on film, and one course was on storytelling. One was on self-publishing and writing. Another one was on blogging and podcasting and things like that. And I know not everybody has those opportunities, but I also started working a little bit with our admissions department. And then also I asked if I could start doing a podcast for my college and producing that. So it's been really interesting because I just sort of looked around and thought, okay, what is something I could do here where I am that would help me be a better communicator and a marketer and a writer that doesn't require me starting some big new thing. So that's definitely one thing I would encourage everybody to do is don't think of your success as someplace that's, it's out there somewhere beyond the rainbow, or it's some far away place that you're going to have to trudge, 2 or 3 years to. There's opportunities that you have literally right in front of you that maybe you haven't thought about before. It could be doing some writing for your church. It could be doing some writing for your job. It could be 100 different things, but just look around you and see what is an opportunity that I have right in front of me to develop some writing related skill. And I think you might be surprised at the things that are literally right around you. Now, one thing that I feel like people struggle with a lot, and I certainly struggle with this, so I'm just speaking kind of out of my own heart and my own struggles, is what do I actually write about? So I don't really write fiction. I mean, I've written a little bit of it, but I'm not a fiction person. So others in the group, and Bridget and Eric and others, you all are far more knowledgeable in that area than I am. So I can't really speak to that. So I pretty much write nonfiction, both for myself and for clients. I'm getting started in ghostwriting and talking with a few book clients right now, but I've been doing freelance writing on the side for several years, and with articles and podcasting stuff and other kinds of content marketing and things like that. So the vast majority of my stuff is really nonfiction. And when it comes to things to write about, I'm a big fan of, again, seeing what's right in front of you that speaks to you that might be helpful to somebody else. I know sometimes I rack my brain and I get really stressed out because I think, oh, I've got to have something really earth-shattering to say, in a blog post or in a book chapter or on social media. And it has to be really profound, and it has to be, perfectly written and all those kinds of things. And I've really kind of gotten away from that. And of course, I'm a fan of excellence, but I know that I'm such a perfectionist at heart that, when I do something that I feel is probably 90%, most other people are going to see that as 100% because I'm such a perfectionist. So, like, for example, I started reading this book. This is a Louis L'Amour book, an old one from the 1960s, I think. I got this at a book sale a few months ago. And I never read one of his books before, so I started reading it recently. And it's a good book. It's really fun. It's really enjoyable. And I knew that he had written a lot of books, but I didn't know how many books that he had written. So today I did a little bit of research, and I was shocked to discover that he actually wrote 100 novels, which is crazy. And he didn't start writing until he was in his early 40s. So I tried to do a little bit of math and come to find out the average amount that Louis L'Amour had to write every day, again, this is on average, to produce 100 novels over the span of almost 40 years was just a little over 400 words a day, which is really nothing. I mean, you can sit down and do that really, really quickly for the most part. And so that struck me as something that was like, wow, if he can do that, one of the most successful novelists of all time, surely I can do that. Surely most people can just write a few hundred words a day. And if we're consistent with it, we can build this really cool thing of lots of books and other content. So that really struck me. So I just put a post up on Facebook. It took maybe 7 or 8 minutes to write. And if you go to my profile, you'll see a picture of that book there and just a few paragraphs of just what I discovered. So I would encourage you, when you're thinking about things to write about and you're racking your brain going, oh, what can I say that would be helpful to people? Just think of something that's been helpful to you in the past 24 hours. And many times, if you just put that out there, that can impact people in some really powerful ways, I think. Then I wanted to say one more thing. I've got lots of things. I'm a college teacher, so I could ramble on like for hours, which is not helpful to anybody. But something that I'm increasingly doing more and more that's really helpful to me is I'm using my phone for dictation. So whenever I have an idea for a podcast episode or a blog post or a social media post or really any kind of content idea, more often than not these days, instead of sitting down on my computer and typing it out, I just use my iPhone and I use the dictation feature on there. I'll just go, "Hey Siri, you know, make a note," and then I can just dictate whatever it is that I want to dictate. And once you learn the grammar and the idiosyncrasies of how your phone processes language and punctuation and grammar and all that stuff, it's actually pretty accurate if you speak clearly. So increasingly, I'm using that because you can typically speak faster than you can type. At least I can. So that's just a little tip that has been really helpful for me in just getting more writing actually done. And then you can go back and clean it up, of course. But those are just some helpful tips for me. I don't know if they're actually helpful or not, but there's just some ways that I'm getting writing done these days.
Thanks, Kent, too. And one of the things that Kent has told me in the past, too, about writing is what are questions that people are asking you a lot about? And, that should be a topic that maybe you want to write about. Things that, things that are continually coming up. I know that's how I wrote some of my books on sexuality. People were asking me a lot of questions about that, how I navigated that. And so instead of answering them over and over and over, finally I just said, let me just answer a lot of these questions in a book. I'll give that to them, and then they can come back and ask more detailed questions. But it was sort of a pragmatic approach for me, but I love that Kent does that. And Ken, I'm just going to go to your email too that had a few of these tips on it,
Oh, okay.
because I loved it, and I know you could say a lot of things, but one of you had like 8 questions here. One of your questions was, who is the ideal reader? And I wonder if you could just talk about that for a second.
Yeah. So for me, this is a key question. Now, again, I do nonfiction, but I think it would apply to fiction as well. Is that I have an ideal reader in mind for the stuff that I write for myself. Any content that I do for my podcast or for my blog or for my email subscribers, my ideal audience member is a business person or an entrepreneur who wants to use writing to grow their business. So that's why my podcast is called Smart Business Writing. That's why pretty much everything I write is geared toward people who are busy and people who want to use writing to grow their business. And I think that is an important principle of figuring out who your ideal reader is, whether it's, if you're writing for single moms who are busy and trying to juggle raising kids with a job and other responsibilities. Maybe your ideal audience person is lumberjacks. Maybe it's car mechanics. Maybe it's plumbers or attorneys, or maybe it's not something related to a career or a job. Maybe it's a person who thinks a specific way. Whatever it is, I do think it's important to think about, who am I writing for? What are their pain points? What are their struggles and frustrations? And then how can you address those frustrations with your writing? Now, again, that's nonfiction. Obviously, if you're writing fiction, you're probably going to have a specific genre that you're writing in as well. But that really helps narrow things down a lot. And for me, knowing who my ideal reader is, it helps cut out a lot of stuff. Like if I have an idea that I want to talk about that doesn't really fit that lens of a business person or an entrepreneur, and it wouldn't be helpful to them, then I just don't use it. So for me, that's actually really been helpful.
That's great. And I'm just going to quote a little book from my book, because my first bigger book that I wrote after my devotionals is called What God Says About Sex. These were questions that people were asking me, a lot of questions. And so I was going to sit down. It took me like 7 years before I finally wrote this book, because I'm like, how do I answer these questions? But I was asking, who would be the reader? I was asking God, I wanted to be able to picture them in my mind as I wrote these words. Who would my reader be? And God said, without hesitation, write it for your children. And I said, my children? I thought, that's not who I had in mind at all. I mean, my kids were all young, grade school age. But when I realized that God was serious, my passion and diligence for this project increased 100-fold. I realized the readers of this book would not just be people on the far side of the globe who could take or leave these words as they wished. The readers would be my own precious children, the ones I wanted most to see enjoy the fullness of sex without experiencing the pain that has fallen upon so many. Then God nudged my heart again, and I realized this is exactly who he wanted to reach through this book, his own precious children, the ones that he most wanted to see enjoy the fullness of sex without experiencing the pain that has fallen on so many. But it changed the focus of my book to say, oh my gosh, this is not just a writing project. This is going to be a matter of serious significance for generations to come, and my children and their children. And it changed the tone and tenor of the book and my passion for it. There's just great wisdom, I think, Kent, in your first thing, who are you writing for? And it's the same Mary Felkins mentions here, know your audience. You're writing romance novels, you know what they want. You write to that audience. Bridget, when you're writing a Focus on the Family article, you know what they need. They need family advice, whatever it is. So know your reader. I would love to take just maybe a short little exercise break, Kent. I don't know if you could sort of guide us through this. But if people, after they've heard all these different ideas or strategies or ways to write, could we do maybe a 5-minute exercise of just give them some time to write and say, what would be your big idea? Who would be your ideal reader? What would be the first couple chapters or first 8 to 12 chapters? I don't know. Anything you have in mind, Kent, that might be a good professorial approach to that?
I think just taking a couple minutes and writing down who your ideal reader is, that in itself is really, really helpful. And to me, that's where it starts, because then you know specifically who you're writing to. And the more specific that you can get with it, the better, I think.
Great. Well, maybe if you're up for doing that, let's take just a few minutes here and just write down who your ideal reader is for the topic that's on your heart, whether it's fantasy or an article or a blog post or a book. If I had my Spotify playlist on, I would play a little music for you here. I could run down to the piano, I suppose, and do something live if you want. I see we're at the top of the hour here, so I want to take a shift for our second part of the hour. Clay, it looks like you're signing off here.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Clay. Thanks for joining us. Did you have
Blessings
any questions or thoughts before you go?
I direct my writing to family and men.
Family men. Yep. Got a great audience there.
You bet.
Eric.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Clay, it's all right. Have a good night.
Okay. Yeah, Eric, I had also typed in the chat the ideal audience just because I've had to do that for proposals. It's hard to really know because, as I said, I kind of narrowed it down to, it's not real narrow, but women age 18 to 65, and just recently had somebody in her 70s that read it, a retired nurse. So, and she was happy with it.
Terrific. Wow. That's great. Mary writes romance novels. Is that your main genre, only genre?
It
Yep.
is.
So she's focusing on that. Her latest book is called Call to Love, which I'm just a few chapters away from finishing. I won't give away the spoiler.
It turns out, okay, that's what romance means. Everybody gets a little bit weird about, thinking it's trashy, but it just means that's the genre that they end up together. So I don't spoil anything by telling you that. So.
And Mary, I love your book because you don't blast people with faith, but faith is definitely an element throughout it, and you have a Christian worldview about dating and relationships, and you bring up the hard questions of pregnancy outside of marriage, or all kinds of things, but you address it from a Christian worldview that I love, and I think that's the kind of writing I love encouraging and seeing people do. So thanks.
I appreciate that. So I
Yeah.
got to sign off.
All right,
It's
thanks, Mary.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Night.
Dusty's asking, your book, Mary, is called Called to Love by Mary Felkins on Amazon or Amazon Kindle, right? And then,
Mhm.
and there's another
Yeah.
publisher does a hardback for you.
Publisher does the hardback, and then I have hardbacks here as well.
Or maryfelkins.com.
Thank you, Eric.
Yep, glad to network each other so you guys can share and encourage each other in your writing. So thanks, Mary.
Good night.
And I see some comments in the chat here. Dan, were you waving at me?
I was just waving it by.
Oh, you're waving to Mary. Okay, great.
Mary. Yep. Oh, go ahead.
Maybe could you read some of those comments in the chat room to us, Dan, that people are talking about what they're writing about?
Yeah, we have, I guess, from Marjorie, people interested in Holocaust history. From Dusty, we have ideal reader would be adolescents and adults in drug and alcohol abuse. We have, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, forgive me if I mispronounce E. Geiger. People who want to learn about theology and to learn how to think Christianity about life and the world around us. And then we have stressed moms or women with challenging life situations.
Thanks. Others want to jump in with things that you are writing for, topic people you're writing for. You'll have to unmute yourself though.
Yes, Dan, Seekers and Skeptics for me. And just listening to the kind of some of the conversation, reading through some of the comments, I think, Eric, you mentioned not necessarily need to be explicitly Christian, but maybe suggestive or indicative of Christian teachings, philosophies, principles, ultimately gospel in there somewhere. If you squint, you can see the gospel. And I was reminded just real quickly of when I'm a big C.S. Lewis fan. And if anybody's ever read the Space Trilogy, talks about this basically takes a trip to Mars and then comes back, and nobody believes the story, even his best friend that he's telling it to. And he says it's not really important that everyone believe every word and every detail so much as they are familiarized with certain ideas. They realize that they're eventually going to need to convince people, but they can't come right out and explain everything that happened because no one will believe it. But they can at least share little kernels of information or suggestions that later will make it easier for them to understand. So they kind of provide a foundation, early on. And I kind of see that as something that I want to do too, is to write fiction that is maybe not explicitly Christian, but it helps to kind of lead toward the gospel being more receptive.
That's great. Thanks, Dan. And Jonah, you're jumping into some fantasy fiction too, right?
Yep. At least attempting to.
Who would be your ideal reader?
So I just wrote down that there are a lot of geeks like me out there who have a lot of questions about why things are the way they are and what would life be like if things were a little different. And I kind of like exploring that kind of stuff too. So that's kind of what my ideas are right now, just trying to figure out, how to tell old stories in new ways.
Terrific. There's another guy that might have joined us tonight, but he didn't, that's also trying to write in your similar genre. So I think that would be great to connect you guys together later too. Laura Carr, who's your ideal reader? If you don't mind sharing.
Well, I have a lot of ideas for my audience, but I really enjoy writing about trauma and specifically for pastors or people that are leaders in the church, on helping them understand trauma, complex trauma, developmental, attachment, interpersonal, intergenerational, those types of things. as well as I'm kind of specializing a bit in my writing with spiritual abuse and things along those lines. So I'm currently hoping just to share comfort I've received with other people. So anyone in need of comfort from trauma as well as grief. I guess for like my dad passed away, so I'm writing a lot for other people who have lost loved ones. It's called complicated grief. So if there's like complex situations and then that person dies, it's a little more complicated than just your typical grief. So that's kind of some of my audience's ideas right now, but I have a lot of ideas, so I haven't written anything. We'll see.
Thanks. You did just get what was your degree in? You just graduated.
Master's in clinical mental health counseling.
Yeah, so this is right up your alley and perfect.
Yeah.
I can't wait
And
to see what books you're going to write.
Yeah, I'm writing a lot for foster parents, adoptive parents right now too, so.
Okay. And I know some of you, I don't know some of you. Thomas, I don't know you. I sort of think your email said you're from Brooklyn, maybe. Is that right?
Yes, I am.
What are what's on your heart to write, and who's your audience, if you don't mind sharing?
I think it would be for pastors and Christian leaders who feel that they've either been left behind or ignored, and that they don't have the kind of what do we call in America success in ministry, and but that God has not left us and has not abandoned us. That takes a lot of faith and continued effort to trust Him for the outcome that He's promised, and not our own particular level of satisfaction.
And this is part of your background. You're a pastor, I'm guessing, or?
I'm retired, or if there is such a thing.
So you have written, and as someone said last month, they had to do an oral report every Sunday.
That's a good way of putting it. I have been out of pastoral ministry for about 15 years, but I think I'm writing from some of the experiences that I've been through, and I know there are others who are out there as well, particularly those who serve in inner cities and in rural places where the numbers are not that great.
Great, thanks. And Kent, I see you have to go. Any closing thoughts before you check out?
Yeah, sorry, I gotta run. Yeah, I think my main encouragement would be to just think about what your next step is, whatever that thing is. It doesn't have to be anything major or huge. It could just be, hey, I want to put a little post on Facebook talking about something that I've learned today, or I want to send out an email to maybe a few people, or I want to write a chapter in my book or do a blog post, or whatever it is that is important to you. I know many times I get paralyzed by all the things that I feel like I should be doing, and I don't actually make any forward progress. So I just want to encourage you to think about what the one next right thing is for you to do, no matter how small it is, and just do that thing, because it'll really give you a great sense of momentum, I think.
That's terrific. If you need lots of ideas, just pick one and give it a shot. One that resonates with you. Thank you, Kent. Others, I'm glad to keep this as an open discussion. I'm not going to necessarily call on each of you. Just feel free to raise your hand or just unmute yourself and talk. It's a little more free form here in the second hour, and we don't have to sit. Yeah, Paul.
Okay. I have really two directions of writing I do. I started out about 4 years ago. I started a Facebook group for Christians, Bible, Prophecy, and Grace. And so what I do is I write a lot of posts But those two twin topics, Bible prophecy, especially looking for Christ's return, and also the grace of God by which we are saved and are kept safe. So I address eternal security a great deal. I try to encourage people, keep looking how Jesus is coming back. So we got like 3,900 members now. So that's on one side. I also wrote, I wrote a book on Romans. It looks like it's backwards, but Romans Essentials of the Christian Faith. And that, again, is trying to be rightly dividing, to just give the essence of what the Romans is teaching, without a lot of high theological stuff. And it's gotten 5-star reviews, so I guess it's good. That's the one focus, the Christian areas. But the other one is that I like writing science fiction. I wrote a superhero novel in this day and age of superhero movies. So that one's got 5 stars at Goodreads. And I also wrote probably my favorite would be The Hiders in Darkness, and it's a Christian sci-fi fantasy book. And so one of the things I liked about writing is that I wanted getting started with writing. That was my first real effort of starting. When I was a teenager, I was reading lots of books. My dad would have people like Edgar Rice Burroughs and other novels, and I decided, gosh, I'd like to write my own exciting adventure. So I wrote quite a number of different short stories, but eventually I got around to writing a book. And I liked your point brought up earlier about plotters versus pantsers. I do a little bit of both. I start out with the pantsers, but then I start bogging down. I realize I have to sit down and work out the plot so I know where to go with it. So I do a combination of both. But I do recommend a book. It's called Plot and Structure. It's by James Scott Bell, and it's a wonderful book for helping you develop a plot and a structure. If you want to write a book and you want to get started.
Bridget has the same book.
Oh, excellent. That's obviously two great minds think alike. But it's a wonderful book, and if you want to start writing a novel, that is your book to go to.
Plot and Structure, by who was that?
By James Scott Bell.
All right.
So it's I've now written 4 books. I'm working on a sequel for The Hiders in Darkness. I'm up to chapter 20. I also, the superhero book, Starlast, I wrote that with the 30 Days National Month, Write a Novel a Month contest. And I made my goal. So that was kind of fun. That one got 4 stars. All my books have got 4 stars. What can I say?
Congratulations on getting the novel done. And one of my hopes for this group is that you might even take that challenge this November too, and write a book in a month, and just
to get that done, you need to average 1,667 words per day. It can be done. It's about 4 pages a day. So I do encourage, if you haven't tried writing a novel in 30 days, talk about putting your nose to the grinding wheel. It'll do it though. You can do it.
It is. That's great encouragement. And thanks, Paul. Paul's, I just met him tonight. We talked a little earlier from Chicago, and interested also in marketing tips. So we'll be talking about that a few sessions down the road. But good to meet you, Paul. Thanks for jumping in. I saw some other comments, Dan, on the side. Anything you want to highlight?
I'll jump in there.
Okay, Melanie, thanks.
Hey, Eric. Good to see you again,
And
sir.
Melanie, I'll just say, Melanie, I met at a conference, and she was the first one. She asked me to sign my book, this first book that I wrote, and I was like, oh my gosh, somebody wants me to sign it. This is crazy. I'm not, like, I was embarrassed by it, but that was so nice. And it just somebody actually wanted me to sign a book. So that was a while ago.
It's a powerful book.
Thanks.
It really is, Eric. I want you to hear that again, okay?
Oh, thanks. Yes, go ahead.
You're welcome. So I joined the John Maxwell team for trainers, speakers, coaches kind of thing last year, and I freaked out. And the reason why I'm sharing this is because you're asking a question tonight that I've been working on for over 6 months of attempting to get to what is my ideal audience. And another way to say it is, what is a problem that I help solve? And so with that, even though I've been working on this, I kind of had that, oh no, I don't know what I'm doing. Okay, that whole imposter syndrome that I've heard so many other people have been able to face, like look at it, face it, and walk through it. and get on the other side to where I know that I know that I'm doing what Papa's called me to do. And that is, so now here's my answer to your question. My ideal audience is people who have survived childhood, sexual, physical, well, I don't need to say childhood. People who have survived sexual, physical, emotional abuse and neglect, specifically the folks who have not been able to process the painful trauma and need help, and this is where I come in, and need help in developing safe teams. Because without a safe team, a person's not going to get through this life. And there's, the way I describe it to people is, you know, if you can see my hand right here, put it above my head, people pouring into me, like a one-way street, mentors, counselors, therapists, pastors, spiritual directors, those people pouring into me, they're a safe team, but also peers, my brothers and sisters, particularly my sisters, but brothers are real important as well, in to where I'm investing in them and they're investing in me. And then me eventually, once I'm safe enough, once I have strong enough boundaries, once I have enough joyful capacity, I can then become part of someone else's safe team, and I can invest in them. And so it doesn't just get stuck inside me, you know, that whole, I've learned a whole lot and it's not going out, you know, it's not going back out to others. So that's the long version. The short version is safe teams.
I love it.
Helping, that's the problem I help people solve, is developing safe teams.
I love that idea of just, you know, coming up with that, you know, that key statement. Who's your ideal audience? What's your, you know, what's sort of your personal mission statement of, you know, what are you trying to, what's the niche you're trying to fill? And you've said you've wrestled with this for 6 months or so. And
over 6 months. My very first John Maxwell conference was last August, and they asked the question, "Who's your audience?" I went, "Oh, and what's the problem you help solve?" I went, "I have no clue. I don't know what I do. I'm serious." And then I had to process. Thankfully they had a little worksheet. But then I went home and I started asking the people I speak with, the people I mentor, the people I sponsor, the people who I invest in, right? And I say, how do I help you?
yeah,
What do I do that helps you? What am I already doing, in other words? And that was really helpful. It was terrifying in some ways. You know, it was like, oh my goodness, am I going to find out that I really don't do anything after all? That Anyway, I am in my car in the Publix parking lot here in Tallahassee, Florida. So
okay,
that's why I've had my screenshot picture up earlier. I was actually doing some shopping and I had my earplugs in while listening to y'all. Fantastic. Before I forget, thank you, Eric.
Oh, you're
This
welcome.
is exactly, I just finished writing my memoir. It's at my editor's. She's supposed to get it to me next week. And I'm like, and I remember you sharing a long time ago about how you published your books. And then I just saw your post the other day. And I went, exactly what I need, a community, a safe team, right?
Yes.
A safe team for these next steps.
Terrific. Thanks,
So,
Melanie. Thanks. That's really
you.
helpful to share. And, you know, maybe you don't have a
Yeah.
defined mission yet. Maybe you don't have a defined purpose yet. And that will come as you write more and write more. And, you know, maybe you'll have several purposes and you can do several genres. And there's all kinds of things. But I love that, just being able to identify your audience. Heather, you wrote something here. I wonder if you could just share about you came up to me the other day and said you were so excited about writing this book about police officer wives. What clarified for you tonight, and what's your book about?
Yeah, I've been working on kind of what I'm calling an elevator pitch. My husband and I have been married over 20 years, and for 16 of those years, he was a police officer until about 3 years ago when he chose to get out of the profession. And so I did a lot of writing during that time and just kind of put it up on the shelf. So I dusted that project off after our first meeting last month. And this is my elevator pitch that I kind of refined during our exercise because I already have an audience. So it is, this book provides an honest account about what I learned as the wife of a police officer and the unique challenges that police families face in our world today. I share how I grew in my faith, made mistakes, and faced my fears, retelling my story with plenty of humor and authenticity, with doses of truth and encouragement along the way. And I share a lot of funny stories in there too. There are some pretty crazy things that happen when you have a house of 3 boys. And I also am a trained marriage and family therapist. And so I share a lot of insights in what can happen in a marriage, in the police family, just experiences that we had and what God taught me about. There were just so many valuable lessons about where I could have just jumped ship. I could have continued to cultivate an independent spirit. I just really held on to anger or resentment. There's just so many nuggets that God gave me over the years, and I just really want to encourage police wives that they're not alone, but also to encourage them in their faith and to share my story and to share Jesus. And the irony is that, so as I already know how I want to end the book, I want to just briefly share the irony that my husband has come out of that profession, and in the last 3 years, I am ironically working with sex trafficked victims and in ministry full-time, helping develop programming to give them healing and wholeness in Christ. So it's just kind of a interesting way how God weaves our lives and equips us and gives us experiences and sets us up for the next chapter. So I'm excited.
That is great. And it sounds like, as you were reading that sounds like that would be really nice on the back of your book.
Okay.
Even in third person or something. This is a book about, the exact elevator pitch that you gave. I don't know, Bridget, what you think, but it sounded like great copy for the back of the book.
It sounded, that's exactly what I thought. Back copy.
Okay.
Copy paste. You got your ending, you got some stories, and you got something to go on the back cover. So
great.
I think that's great. I love
Thank
that. I look forward to reading your book and just learning. I was telling Heather that sometimes you think your own story is just so boring. Bridget talks about her boring life. She has incredible stories, but if you just talk about your life and what you do, it's so interesting to other people. You wouldn't think it's very interesting to other people, but I've never been a police officer's wife. I don't know what that life is like. I don't know anything about what that would be like on a daily basis to have to face that, what all the challenges that you face. And I just think it would be fascinating. I don't remember if I shared in this last book, or in the last episode, but a friend of mine, Greg Potzer, his mother, when she was in grade school, her teacher said, everybody has $1 million book inside them. They just have to tell their own story, but they have to be brutally honest. You just have to tell your own story, but you have to be brutally honest. And that sort of drove me to write my 50 Shades of Grace book and say, wow, if I was really honest about some of these issues in my life, I'm like, it's just normal life for me. I'm a farm kid, grew up on the farm in central Illinois, and wandered off into some sexuality that wasn't healthy for me and for others. And, I'm like, this is not going to be interesting to anybody. And I was amazed at the number of people who read it and afterwards just had so many questions and were so fascinated. They didn't, I don't know, whatever it was about the book, but they, it was like, that was very new to them, very unusual, very, interesting to people. So maybe next session, I'm trying to think what our next session is going to be. I've got a few ideas, but one of them might be, what content do you include in your book? How do you tell a story that's brutally honest without vomiting all over people, without disclosing other people's stories, without, how do you select those stories that you're going to tell in a way that's really helpful for a reader and protects the privacy and confidentiality of others. And so maybe that will be a topic for next time. But we'll see what our next month is going to be. But other thoughts tonight. I saw Rebecca, you had a note here. Did you want to say anything, or is your typing text just enough? You don't want to talk?
Oh, no, that's okay. I can talk. I just don't know if I'm echoing. I think I am.
Nope, you're fine. And Rebecca is Kirk's wife, and they do our care group ministry at church, which really provides intense emotional care for people going through various traumas. So.
Right. I'm in process right now trying to figure things out, but what I wrote is for the women, any women that are going through a difficult time in their life, to be able to know that they are not alone, and to help encourage and share stories, basically, in my walk. And then also I'm in the ministry of Deeper Still, those women and men that have gone through and have had an abortion. And so I'm processing all of that and how to target that audience as well. And the reader, just being able to share my story and being able to help encourage in their walk as well. And the trauma that's involved in both of either going through a divorce or going through grief or going through childhood trauma. I know that what Laura was talking about with the trauma as well, it's just sharing stories as we go. What you said, Eric, was so helpful. Tell your own story, but be really honest. And I've always felt that, and just being able to share that. I don't want it all inside. I want to be able to share it outwardly. So, but still in that process of trying to find that ideal audience, but that's where I'm at. I'm fresh in this game, and so wanting to get those ideas down.
I love that, Rebecca. And I've known you for several years, but I just first heard some of your story just in the past year, and I was like, wow, I'm so proud of you for sharing, and proud of you for reaching out to others, because so many people can benefit from what you're talking about. And I love that Deeper Still ministry as well. If you're not familiar with that, it's is it a weekend retreat, or do they do other things too, Rebecca?
No, it is a weekend retreat. There's two, as of right now. We have a Central Illinois chapter, and it's for men and women. We have a retreat that will be coming up at the end of April. It is full right now, but we do have a waiting list. Full for women. We still have room for men. And then in October, we have another retreat. And that's usually what they are, the spring and then the fall. We're looking at having a summer retreat as well, but that may be in 21. I'm not for sure yet.
Okay.
But it's for men and women that have had an abortion in their life, in their past, and it's a healing. It's a very healing retreat, and just showing God's love and mercy and grace, and just pouring it out for all of the guests that are there. So it is so beneficial.
Thanks, Rebecca, for sharing about that too. A few others I haven't heard from. Pixel 3, is that Phil? Is that you joined us? I don't know if you heard our question that we were sort of talking about, was just who's your ideal audience? But if you don't have an answer for that too, that's fine. If you just want to share some of the things you've written a few things that would be helpful for people.
I don't know if it's helpful for anybody else, but when I first started writing, that was a sticker for me. It just paralyzed me trying to think of who I was writing for. I thought of a couple of different audiences I wanted to write for, but as I was writing, it just forced me to write a particular way, and I wasn't comfortable writing. So I just decided, and I think this is what God was leading me to do, just write the way you want to write, and I'll find the audience for you and match you with that. And so I started writing, and I wrote my first book and published that through Create Space. It's wasn't bought by anybody, but that's okay. But what came out of that was it was picked up by a church locally who used it for a men's Bible study. And the guy who led it was an elder that I knew from that church. not a college educated person, but one of the most well-read, godly men that I knew. And he called me and he said, I read your book and I liked it. And I said, well, then I'm done. That's all I wanted to know was who I wrote it for. And if you liked it, then that's high praise, and I appreciate it. He invited me to come to the first meeting of the men's Bible study that was using it and just make a presentation about the book. And when I walked in, he pointed to this guy that looked like he just walked in off the farm. He was wearing bib overalls and looked like he was already at work that morning and ready to go back after Bible study. And he said, that guy over there, he told me he doesn't like reading. He hardly ever reads a book, but he liked yours. I said, okay, I found my audience. And I think what it is I tend to, whether it's writing, talking, whatever I do, I follow a quote that I heard from Abraham Lincoln. He said, God must have loved the average man. He made so many of them. So when I write, talk, I don't use big words. I understand that the average reading ability is probably about 5th, 6th grade. And so I just write the way I talk and write, I hope to the majority, I guess, and hope that it finds an audience. That was the first book I wrote. The last one, again, I just had this one printed. It's called I'm Not Good Enough. And that one's based on a lot of, I'm a psychologist. And so I see a lot of people every day that come in and say that very same thing, that somewhere in their life, they just felt like they weren't good enough. They didn't measure up. They feel inadequate. And they just carried that into adulthood. And I identified with that because I grew up with a lot of that same attitude and belief about myself. It even influenced my relationship with God to where I felt like no matter what I do, it's not good enough for God. And it became a journey, something that I had to get resolved and find peace with. And I finally, over a number of years, was able to find peace in dealing with that question. And the answer to the question is, so what? I'm not good enough, but that's a worldly standard that I don't have to live up to, and God doesn't use it. And so the book is basically that journey that I took and what influenced me to believe that I wasn't good enough, but then what helped me to change that. So if that has a more particular audience, although again, it's pretty widespread, but the people that are interested, I've just put it out on Facebook mostly and talked to people I know, and the ones that seem to be interested are ones that, yeah, we've struggled with that too, and we'd like to know what you did about it, and maybe something in there will help. So still hoping it'll catch on and spread a little bit further, but maybe that's something I'll learn from your group.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, that's great. And yeah, you're not just going to get good writing tips, you're going to get good book recommendations in this group too. So I'm sure each of you has things that you're going to latch on to that sound good to you. Phil is a licensed professional counselor. Is that what is that the title?
Yeah, clinical psychologist.
The name of your book is I'm Not Good Enough. Yes.
Yeah, but the only way to get it is through me. I just had it printed with Steuben Publishing.
You'll have to find him on Facebook, Phil Foster.
Do we just start talking, Eric? Or
Yep,
what do we
go
do?
ahead. Go ahead, Connie.
Okay. All right. So I write poetry. I've written, literally I have hundreds of poems that I've been writing since I was baptized in the Spirit, which was in 1990. And some of them are written about, life situations, and some are written about photographs. Like I look at a photograph and write a poem about the photo. And I have no clue what my audience would be. Just anyone who likes poetry, I guess. But somehow figuring out how to compile poems that are about more specific subjects, more similar subjects, I guess. How many poems do you put in a book? How do you correlate the photos with the poems with minimal expense? Because usually it's kind of expensive to put photographs, a lot of photographs in a book. And I've been told over the years, by different people who've read some of the poems that I should publish them. And I have two that I actually had submitted to, those poetry contests, which you just send it in and they publish if they feel like your poem is good enough. And two of them have gotten published, and one of them they used as the very first poem in the book. And it's called The Listening Chair, about how it's really important to hear with the ears of a child and not to read into words the meaning you think is hidden in them, because children don't do that. They hear what you say and they respond to that without trying to analyze, and how God tries to communicate to us a lot of times like that. But anyway, that's probably my biggest concern, because I have a basket with my poems in it. I have books with poems. I have little papers here and there with poems, and what to do with all of them, how to organize them, because I write according to what I'm going through at the time, or what God shows me about a specific subject, or reading scripture. I wrote a poem when we were reading for our women's Bible study about, in Leviticus 13 and 14, about how, the people back in Jesus' time, when they had leprosy, what they had to go through in order to be inspected by the priests and become outcasts. And I wrote a poem about it last night. And then there's this other idea I have about how, through my life and my family's lives, we've survived a lot of traumatic issues, and just how God uses various events and situations to transform you and to establish your identity in Christ when you turn to Him, and how He's the only one who can deeply heal you and make you whole and establish your boundaries, so that it's as if in some ways that abuse never happened, because He's healed you to that extent. And without Christ, some people would be mentally ill, perhaps committed, even, because the trauma is so overwhelming. And yet through Christ, it becomes a tool through which He establishes empathy and compassion and the ability to pray for others who might be suffering.
Connie knows a lot of trauma. You're a nurse, is that right, Connie?
I'm a nurse, yeah.
You've seen that kind of trauma too, but
I've seen that kind of trauma too. So reaching out, dealing with people, in hospital situations, So it's interesting, how God uses, your own life to interact with other people in whatever career He chooses for you too.
And I saw a comment here on the side in the chat room, Connie, from Laura Carr saying, I love poetry and just started writing poems. Would love to read your writing, Connie. So maybe in the chat room, you guys could share some email addresses or something, and you could share some of your poems with her. But I don't know if you were here at the beginning, but just the way I publish my books, I just upload a PDF file of all my information to Amazon, kdp.amazon.com. It's a free website, and you just upload your PDF. You can create a little cover up there, and for $2.15, you can have a little 100-page book. And so there are great ways to get your books out. We'll talk more about that in the future, but you're welcome to share with each other.
Okay.
Your contact information, just even to have people share your writing with each other here in this group. So that's great. If anybody else has something you want to talk about, ask about, and then at the end, I just want to share 2 secret tidbits with you, just of my own writing that I don't I don't know if I've ever shared before. So anyway, and Marjorie, I see you wrote something on the side here too. You want to share about that, or you just want to leave that? Okay, she doesn't want to say. Dan, you want to read that for her?
Yep, so this is from Marjorie. We have a family member who shared her life experience in concentration camps. I'd like to tell her story and emphasize how God used her and how others were God's hands and feet. Ultimately, it was a love story on 2 levels, with her husband and with God.
Any others care to share about your ideal audience or what you're working on? And then we're going to wrap up for the night.
The group made me think about what my ideal audience is, I think.
Thanks. Who would that be, Al, do you think?
They helped me to find it in my own mind a little bit, so I jotted down that my ideal audience would be those on the fence, those needing encouragement, those on the edge, those seeking hope, and myself, who is often these other people I'd like to write for. So I guess encouragement. I'd like to write things that are encouraging.
Thanks, Alan. Al does a daily Bible reading. It's on Facebook if you want to look him up. 2020 Bible reading, daily Bible reading, and he just gives some commentary on some scripture and ways it's impacting him, and shares it with a group of people. He's done that for several years, and he's working on some other personal projects we'll talk about more down the road. But just thought I'd give a pitch for your daily thing on Facebook if people want to check out that.
Thanks, Eric.
Anybody else? And then I'll share my 2 secrets. All right, secret number 1. I found this down in my basement. This is the first book I wrote when I was 10 years old. Called The Secret Suitcase. And we had an assignment, and a teacher would type it up for us. We told them what the story was, and I drew the pictures and the artwork. It even says author Eric Elder. I don't remember seeing this before. So, gosh, I was an author in 1973, apparently. But it was about the secret suitcase that I had put together from a junkyard stuff, and it could answer any question. It was great for tests and things like that. Basically, it was Google about 25 years before Google existed. Had I just done the computer programming, I could have made millions. My other secret is when I wrote my first longer book, this one called What God Says About Sex, as I said, it was like 7 years I was trying to think, how am I going to write this? What am I going to say? I kept starting it. And I couldn't figure out how to tell the story. And at the same time, a book came out that went on the bestseller list, one of the best-selling books of all time, called The Prayer of Jabez. And I really love this author, Bruce Wilkinson, who wrote it, and whatever you might think about it, but he has done all kinds of projects around the world. He taught Walk Through the Bible, which made the Bible very easy for people to, and he did this training seminars. He led hundreds of people to go to Russia and teach about Jesus in the public school system. And he trained teachers how to do this, and they did this with open arms of the Russian government. And he just was a great trainer, teacher extraordinaire. And he came out with a simple little book that really helped me in some personal ways too, and expanded my ministry beyond what that's how I met Al, actually. I was reading this book and praying God would expand my borders, and USA Today emailed me as I was in the middle of this book and praying this prayer, and said, could we do a feature article on your ministry? And they did a half-page full article with pictures of me and my kids and everything. And Al read that out in California at Saddleback, and he's now on my board of directors. Anyway, it just expanded our ministry in some great ways. But I thought, Bruce is a teacher extraordinaire. He's a writer. He's a communicator. I bet, the way he wrote this book probably has a lot of, whether he did it intentionally or not, but it probably has a lot of a synthesis of all his writing style and everything. So as I was writing my book on What God Says About Sex, I said, I'd like a book about the same size, same tone. And so I went through line by line. I transcribed or photocopied, or somehow I got it all into my computer, this entire book. And then I wrote my book based exactly on this, paragraph by paragraph. And when he gave a scripture, I would give a scripture. When he told a funny story, I would tell a funny story. When he brought it back to reality, instead of this deep, intense thing, he brought it to, you know, something lighter, levity. I would bring it back to light and levity. You know, he had so many chapters. I had the same amount of chapters. He started with very short chapters. The middle had the longer chapters. The end had shorter chapters again. I followed it exactly, paragraph by paragraph, thought for thought. Totally different topic. But you know, if you go back and read this, nobody would know this, but if you went back and read this and read these two together, I even did, you know, I tried to do little pull-out quotes like he did. Not because it was a bestseller, although, you know, it was a bestseller for multiple reasons, you know, but sometimes we can learn from these great writers, great communicators. And who writes in your genre? How do they do it? How do they write a romance? How do they write a mystery? How do they write, how many series do they do of whether it's Louis L'Amour or C.S. Lewis and their fantasies? Or, you know, there are actually, you know, you hate to be copying people, but sometimes you hate to reinvent the wheel when something's working really well.
Mm-hmm.
So I haven't done that again with any of my books, but it was the way I first was able to just start writing and say, I like his style. I wouldn't have done it. I just see a note here. Bridget Booth says, that's how Ray Bradbury taught himself to write. Melanie says, do what successful people do. And so sometimes we just, you know, you do little crazy things like that and say, okay, I'm just going to go thought for thought, paragraph by paragraph. And I would never have written it that way. When I wrote my book, 50 Shades of Grace, that's the same book, but really in my style, my voice, my heart. So I love this first book, and it did well. Lots of people read it, and it was, you know, it was well received for that purpose. But my favorite book is this one, because I really was able to explore my own, my voice, and talk about, you know, how I came through all that stuff in a very personal, intimate, brutally honest way. All right, those are my secrets. I'm going to turn off the recording here and just say thanks to all of you for coming. But I'm going to stick around. If you want to talk more, we can. And next month, we'll be back again, third Wednesday, at the same link. So anyway, thanks everybody for coming and participating.